Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Great Women in Compliance, sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and hosted by the Compliance Podcast Network. Our guest today is Christina Marshall, Oracle's Regional Compliance Officer in EMEA and a former colleague of mine from the US Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement. Christina is a seasoned expert in operationalizing compliance in complex multinational organizations, and she has extensive experience in working with regulators across the globe. Welcome, Christina. I'm so happy to have you join us today from Brussels.
Hi, Emma. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. I've really missed you since you up and left us. I think it's been about 12 years. Is that right?
Oh, don't say the years. Oh. It's too long because I miss you terribly all the time.
Oh, well, yeah, the feeling is so mutual. I think you packed up your family and moved to Russia and then to Brussels. So, yes. What have you been up to during this time of the last, like I said, not too many years, but enough to miss you a lot?
Yeah. So, when I was in Russia, as you know, I was teaching law in an LLM program. And then I came to Oracle. I made the decision to go in-house, my first in-house role. And, after having been a litigator at, firm and then being with you at the SEC and enforcement, I thought, I really want one client. I want to go in-house and have one client. And, joke's on me, because when you go in-house at a company like Oracle, a large multinational, you have many clients, right? So it's still the most fantastic decision I've ever made. But you have many clients, many stakeholders. So that
I totally empathize with that. There's the idea of the depth you can get into by serving one client. But like you said, in reality, there's multiple stakeholders that you need to be catering for. No, I love that. Well, look, we're going to get into some of your experience at Oracle and before. But before I do that, I like to ask my guests, how do we get here? So you've obviously had an illustrious career in compliance. But did you choose this career or did it choose you?
Ooh, that's a good question. A little bit of both. So, I was doing securities litigation and more on Wall Street in New York. And more my clients were, dealing with regulatory investigations, FCPA, insider trading, failure to disclose with the SEC. And I had gone on maternity leave and I had come back and I was working with a new partner who had come from the SEC. And he just said to me one day, you need to go there. You need to go to the SEC. And, lo and behold, I did and started doing everything in New York. And this work of anti-corruption work was something that was unique, really, in the basket of assignments that you could get at the SEC. And I just loved it. I loved it because of its global reach. I loved it because also of the mission, right, of what it means to spread that anti-corruption sort of legislation and enforcement, globally.
I mean, and let's just stick with that for a second, because it really does mean a lot. I mean, the impacts are huge, right? It's not just corporate fines, regulations. I think about the communities that are impacted when corruption is rife. Tell us a bit more about that in terms of the larger impact beyond even your direct client.
Oh, so, I'll tell you, the idea of enforcement, right? Enforcement can be really scary. And yes, a lot of companies, fear that and loathe that and totally get that, right? As an in-house lawyer, absolutely. But enforcement can actually, be a change agent for good. And so that is a motivator for companies to change sort of how they engage, right? When they're in public procurement or they're, getting a contract. And then that flows down. And that's actually how the law was intended, right? It was intended to create expectations and, really create no-goes. And that creates a change in culture. And that culture changes not the company only that's enforcing it and doing it, but the customers, right? So at Oracle, we communicate our compliance initiatives to customers, and more customers around the world, whether that be in Kenya, for example, or in Eastern and Central Europe, are telling us, thank you for this. We love what you're doing. And that to me is incredibly gratifying.
I love that. I mean, it's so true. Just the motivation coming from knowing that you can have that impact at scale, and knowing. And I like, my new phrase is having good intentions meet operational reality. And as you said, through what your values, your culture, and what you're asking of your customers and provide to them, you're setting the bar.
Yeah.
Can only impact the whole industry in a
We
beneficial way.
try little by little.
Well, I mean, that's what I always say about the superhero capes, that you really are trying.
But that's actually where the rubber hits the road, right? Because people can talk about, and this is sort of my pet peeve about our industry, compliance professionals, anti-corruption professionals. Everybody says like, oh yeah, do things with integrity, do the right thing. And everybody knows what the right thing is, and everybody knows what it means to act with integrity. But the trick is, how do you operationalize that?
Mhm.
How do you build that into policy, procedures, day-to-day business activities that not only assist the business, propel the business forward, but actually operationalize that concept?
Right. So you facilitate the operationalization of that, because good intentions are all day, but in the operational reality, there are going to be stumbling blocks, there are going to be vulnerabilities, there are going to be shortcuts you feel, confused, or the conundrum as to whether to take them. So yeah, I love it. And then I guess you're right. We get back to systematizing good defaults, systematizing good decision making in the moment. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I was going to ask you, just sticking with your career path for a second before we get into the meat of the podcast, what lessons you've learned through your transition. So your transition, you're a bit of a unicorn because you've done private practice and the government. Now in private sector as an in-house. What lessons have you learned moving through those pieces of our industry?
Wow. Because I'm a litigator at heart, I mean, I think you start that way, and I know you are as well. That never leaves you. I may not be litigating, but that sort of, attitude of protecting your client, positioning your client in the best way possible, being a counselor to your client, right? In the most, high stress kind of situations, that never goes away. And I think that is something that, motivated me to go to the SEC, to really be able to understand where the regulator's coming from. And then I try to bring and synthesize those two experiences into my day-to-day now at Oracle. And one of that, issues is also the regulator is actually our friend, and that is something to translate that internally at any company, I think, is a little bit radical. Like, what do you mean, the regulator scares us. And yes, obviously they are a little scary at times, but at the core, and I fundamentally believe this, they are our partner in what we're trying to accomplish. And it should be seen that way.
And you're right, that does seem odd sometimes, because a lot of people use the regulators as a fear-based motivation. They build their programs around what they think the regulator might want, rather than thinking about how the regulator and the company's needs and wants are probably aligned, right? Most likely aligned. Our missions. I like to remind people that one of the mission parts of the mission of the SEC is capital formation, right? They're there too to help capital formation. They're not there to get in the way. And I love that you bring that up, because I'd love to talk about that fear-based motivation, as opposed to this idea that we're aligned and we can move forward together. No, love it. Well, I wanted to talk a bit more about the SEC and the DOJ, the guidance. So, we talk about prevent and detect, and we talk about maybe crisis counselling. And I can see, as you said, as litigators, we're resilient and we think we can help in those situations. So it's a natural transition for you. But let me ask just maybe the basic question. How does the SEC and DOJ guidance even apply in EMEA, in your work in EMEA?
In the sense of, you mean, how do we, impart that, or how do we, yeah? So it's interesting. The DOJ guidance is very helpful, right? And I know they've made lots of efforts to even be more helpful. And I very much appreciate every time they do an update, it's gives me a couple of days of diving in and refreshing sort of, my sort of, plan of action. So it's probably the lodestone for many corporate compliance programs. And so when I think about that, I think about it in terms of the risks I see in EMEA. So I see everything, not so much starting with the guidance, but starting, as the guidance says, actually, taking that very seriously, starting with the risk assessment. What are the risks in EMEA as opposed to maybe the risks in North America, which are very different. What risks do we have in EMEA is a very massive region, right? What are the risks? And then how do we translate our risk mitigation, our strategies to really be taking the best? And again, the guidance is guidance. It's helpful, taking the best from the guidance to understand that, they did a revision and they talked a little bit about compensation actions, right? So they really said, which I love, that it should be more carrot than stick. They actually prefer that. And, for me, that was great because a lot of people were talking, at least in my company and in other companies that I network with, about the stick part of things. And that's really hard to get through, let's say in EMEA, with our labor laws. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that? The minute they pivoted and they made it very clear it was carrot, it was, exactly what we needed to hear, right? Because that is much more easy to sort of implement and think about for any company dealing in the EMEA space. So that's kind of how we look through it.
100% question of fear-based versus incentive-based, right? And how do you motivate the right behaviors? I think, we often as compliance professionals straddle that policing role and the kind of build the culture role. And absolutely the incentive-based goes better on the build the culture. It's more, I like to call it more sustainable compliance rather than the kind of looking for the bad actors and just focusing on them.
Yeah.
Another thing, so obviously we know there's extraterritorial far reach of the US laws when it comes to, other regions of the world, with public companies in the US that operate globally. But sometimes I do hear some pushback from, especially from customers and partners, even when we're just putting the language in the contracts. Well, why are we focusing on the US or the UK bribery laws? How are you handling that kind of sovereignty versus extraterritorial reach question? How is that showing up for you in EMEA?
Well, what has really been helpful in the last few years is other countries' laws that actually also have the same extraterritoriality. So the French anti-corruption law, Loi Sapin 2, they are an extraterritorial anti-corruption law, and even beyond, right? I mean, it even goes beyond the FCPA in the United States. And so when I speak to almost any, third party who's kind of, pushing back on contract language, I can now say it's not just the US government, right? It's the French government. It's other governments that are also looking at this. And so this is sort of the way of the world, right? This is not a US thing, which is, I definitely get pushback on, we're just not, we don't deal with the US. We don't need to worry about that. This is now a global initiative and many more countries. So if you want to future-proof your contracts, if you want to make sure, let's figure out the good language that we can all agree to now, because you know what, the problem, it's only going to get more difficult if you don't accept this language now, because, these are the things that everyone's going to be demanding of you, not just, this one company, this American-based company.
That's right. And this is also true to say, isn't it, that the global regulators are cooperating more and more. I mean, they were when we were at the SEC when we started, but I think that's evolved significantly. As you said, more local rules have come that either match or exceed the requirements under the US or the UK law. And so, again, I don't want to talk about multilateral cooperation of governments as a threat or a fear-based incentive. Actually, again, it's more governments that are working together with us to make sure we can do what we said.
Yeah. And look, MLATs, right? I mean, I see it all the time. I deal with individual country regulators in EMEA, and I also deal with the US government, and often, and even putting aside the US government, there are inter-country regulators dealing with each other, whether it be on tax issues or AML, anti-money laundering. There are so many cooperation agreements that even go beyond the US. So what I think is really encouraging is, DOJ announced a couple of years ago the anti-piling on, framework. And so that, companies will not have to pay, if they do have to pay fines, they will not have to pay fines, double fines in each jurisdiction. I mean, it's small solace that, if you are in that situation, you don't have to double pay. But I mean, again, yes, it is a recognition of the cooperation and also a recognition that they're not here to hurt companies, right? These initiatives are not there to hurt companies. They're there to enforce really good legislation and good behavior. So, I think there is that recognition.
And, what's your advice to someone that's trying to navigate the guidance from these different regulators? I mean, is it vastly different? Is there a common denominator that we should be working to? How have you handled that at Oracle?
Yeah, so I go with the highest common denominator, right? So the most difficult or the most pervasive, laws. And so for me right now, France is a really good indicator of where we need to be. Public versus private doesn't, matter. I mean, the FCPA, if I'm going to criticize it, it's overly reliant on public sector, government corruption, when corruption in any form, whether it be private or public, is a problem. And so I love the fact that the UK Anti-Bribery Act, back in the day, recognized that. But now you see that other countries like France, we'll use France as a good example, have said, this public versus private distinction, that's not the issue. It's any kind of corruption.
And that makes it a challenge for a company or a compliance function that's trying to scale globally to understand what they need to do in each jurisdiction. But I love your philosophy of, well, let's race to the top, not race to the bottom, not minimum viable compliance, but let's go to the place where they've got the highest requirements. Let's be compliant there, and we should be covered everywhere else. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and then let's make sure we understand it, right? We really understand what that requires. I mean, when the French law came out, it said that we had to do, all companies had to do due diligence on all third parties, including its customers, and the way my company does due diligence is quite, intense. What does due diligence mean, right? So there is, and this goes back to the fear. While I don't think regulators should be feared and they should be seen as partners, that doesn't mean, you just don't push back, you don't discuss, you don't question. I think part of that fear is also companies, practitioners just kind of go into a paralysis and just, I'll do whatever you want, or just kind of a freak out mode, No, you need to think. And I think that's, having been a prosecutor, gives me that sort of, I know how to talk to the government. It's not a fearsome kind of situation. You have to understand where they're coming from, and you have to be willing to defend your position in the company. So if you're going to interpret what a reasonable due diligence is that makes sense for your risk analysis, and again, that's the key, then I think that is enough. You don't need to, twist your company into knots, spend, oodles of money to do something that actually the regulators never wanted in the beginning, right? That's why we're in-house. We are giving them, the company, our clients, the best advice possible based on our expertise and understanding of what actually the regulators want in that particular situation.
Right. And I think you said at the beginning, the guidance starts with, something that's risk tailored, a risk assessment that's tailored to your business. That's what the regulators want us to do, right? They want us to make sure we're doing proper risk management for the actual business we're managing, not trying to boil the ocean here on.
And be able to defend it, explain it, right? They're not going to tell us what the risk is. They want us to understand it and then be able to articulate it and defend it and stand by it.
Right. And as you said, a recognition of that dynamic then allows for it to be more of a partnership, right? Actually, you see that you're both heading for the same thing. You're both trying to work together. No, I like that a lot. Well, let's talk. I mean, we've mentioned risk assessment. I think it really is a foundation of crafting a program. So let's talk about your approach to risk assessment and risk management. Big talk.
So my approach, I think, well, I'll say this about, compliance and risk assessments. It really requires companies, large companies, matrix companies, to break down silos, right? So while, silos are not great in decision-making efficiency, they are also where risk can lurk, and, fester, honestly, if you have silos. And so while, a lot of companies, their organizational structures are complex, and that's, absolutely fine, but we have to be cognizant that we don't want risk to be lurking in areas where, it's not exposed and it's not understood. So one approach to risk assessment that we do is just really understanding and meeting the business. I mean, we're right now, interviewing business leaders about risk. Talking to them, making it a forum where they can talk about it and understand the guidance, let's say, from, and I call the compliance people the risk specialists.
Mm-hmm.
So the businesses are risk managers. They are the risk managers, but the specialists on risk, we're not the managers, the specialists, the people who can help guide are that compliance team, that audit team, whatever you want to call it in the company. And I think it's that collaboration and understanding what each can bring to the role that helps understand, well, what is the real risk in the company? And then have a dialogue around that. Business people are incredibly savvy and smart. They don't spend their days thinking about risk assessments, right? And thinking about it in the way that compliance does. I think that is something that, where we can add value and give them, the idea, the guidance, the vocabulary to talk about what they probably already know is risk in their business, but they haven't had to discuss it in the same sort of way that maybe a compliance person needs to hear it and understand it to then be able to help them come up with a risk mitigation plan.
It's so powerful, the shared language that we can have there, and getting people that are leading the business opportunities, as you said, probably without even realizing it, thinking about risk on a daily basis without saying those words, and then really just formalizing that kind of assessment in their minds. And I love the point you made. I don't want to overlook that risk specialist versus risk manager point. Oftentimes compliance functions take on too much. I think they think that they are managing risk. And that can lead to burnout, overwhelm, blind spots, silos, as you mentioned. But if we actually think about tailoring risk to our business, you're right. We need to get to the actual business managers, make the risk relevant to them, talk in terms of their objectives, but also give them that risk, those risking tools, let's say de-risking tools.
Yes, exactly. And I think sometimes compliance professionals are afraid, and it's not without basis, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think they're afraid that if they say, okay, well, here's the risk, that we've identified, here's the risk concerns, I leave it with you, risk manager, that the risk manager will just be like, well, it's okay, it's fine with me, and I understand that concern. And so therefore the compliance people kind of take it on themselves and push it through and are kind of a little bit maybe, seeing themselves as the ones that have to mitigate, manage, resolve, track everything. And I think that's the wrong dynamic. I understand why they feel that way, but I think the way I've tackled it is, it's not that they can't trust the risk managers. It's that maybe you haven't built the relationship. The company hasn't set the expectations clearly enough, articulated it clearly enough to really create that responsibility in their leadership that they are risk managers. And I don't mean the senior leaders. I don't mean the executives. I really mean, senior to middle risk managers, people who are maybe not in those C-suite conversations, but yet are the risk managers, are making employment decisions, are making decisions about third-party engagement, contracting decisions. They need, I think, a little bit more focus corporate-wide to understand their role as risk managers, to feel comfortable, to be empowered with the skills, with the vocabulary, and with the partnership from compliance.
Yeah, no, this is brilliant, because you're talking really about a sea change in the way that we describe jobs. Honestly, I mean, if you think about a job description, what business lead has the words manage and mitigate risk in their job description? Probably not enough, right? And maybe some, but not enough. On the other hand, as you said, the compliance teams call themselves risk managers. They talk about how they mitigate risk. And I can empathize. You might find someone starts off knowing that the risk manager should manage risk, but they tell, as a compliance officer, you tell the business what to do, and they just don't find the time to do it. And you're like, gap. Well, I guess I'll have to fill that gap. So I can see how that might happen, but we need to push through, as you said, and realize, relationship building is everything, but also just maybe this is basic human psychology, right?
Yeah.
Like, remind people that they own the opportunity. Remind people this is about their goals, not our goals, not the regulators' goals, but their goals to move the business forward, and that you cannot consider an opportunity without checking for your own roadblocks. And I think, to your point, not only are they savvy, they are best placed to manage those risks at source. And anything else will feel like friction, an external process, which seems like another roadblock. So this idea of compliance not being a roadblock, but actually helping you clean sweep the road and giving you the brush to clean sweep whatever comes in your path. I know my analogies go forever, but
no, and backing you up, right? If you, like keeping it, exactly, partnering, supporting, right? And you mentioned, like risk compliance people say, like, go do this. Nobody likes to have that, right? And of course, we're not, in the situation where another, group, we don't have the ability, so it doesn't get done, right? Whereas I would like to change things so that it's not compliance saying, go get this done. It's the risk manager saying, we've got a problem. How do we address this? Can we talk about this? That's what I love to hear.
Also, it's what I love to do. You can see that it's the real joy of our job to be able to bridge that gap again between the good intentions and the operational reality. It's easy, isn't it, to come out of your war and try and say, oh, it's not working. But actually to come out and say, well, why isn't it working? What can I do differently is really the beauty of our job, I think. And you're right. I mean, I'm going to blame lawyers, but lawyers and compliance professionals, we're guilty of just figuring out the rules, stating the rules, and then going back into our rooms and saying, you handle it. And again, the best intentioned of us will sometimes try to take some of that on, but we're not setting ourselves up for success because that's not sustainable either. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So for everyone, we're talking about risk specialists versus risk managers. I really like that. What about the, I want to go back to something you said about silos, because this is really critical. We all understand what silos can mean. But again, there's layers and layers of this. And so one of the things I want to focus on or double down on what you said is our blind spots, like knowing there may be things we don't know, knowing there may be gaps in our knowledge. How do you cover off on that when you plan a risk assessment strategy?
There's no easy way. It means really digging in, Oracle is an amazing company. We are very large, and we will move into a new industry, like with our acquisition of healthcare, Cerner. We do that, and it's fantastic and dynamic. But it means that, as a compliance person, there's a lot to learn all the time. And I think that is why, my team is very effective, is they are curious, they're engaged. When things are changing and moving in the business, they now have the relationships where, it may not be something that's, a communication from corporate. It may just be happening sort of on a regional or a sub-regional level. The business leaders are reaching out because we have, periodic calls and meetings and lots of different touch points, which is very important. They're informing us, letting us know. And then, we're also really good at saying, because we're lawyers, I don't understand that. Can we talk about that a little bit more? Can you, explain that to me? And there's no shame in it. That's what we do. We try to understand our business. We try to understand our clients as lawyers. And so you dig in, you roll up your sleeves, and you understand it and you learn it. And I think there's no easy way about that. It takes the work, and it takes the investment and the time.
And I'm hearing it takes the humility, right? The humility to know what you don't know, the empathy to want to hear it from another person's perspective. And this is magical, Christina. If you can build your teams around these philosophies, I think you're right. You're going to be much more effective. And look, the guidance doesn't say that, right? But what it does say, and I think this is where we're bridging that gap, it does say make your decisions on what to prioritize risk-based, right? And risk-based means based on a risk assessment. I always laugh because I always say that the risk assessment or the gap analysis is just the diagnosis of the list of things you might need to do. Then you've got to make decisions as to what of those things you can do, short-term, near-term, long-term. And I think that's where a lot of us get stuck. We're like, the risk assessment showed us lots of gaps. Where do we begin? So what's your advice on, again, we know what it means, but what's your advice on practically prioritizing once you've done your risk assessments?
I think it goes back to understanding you can't do everything, right? And so prioritizing really means, to be realistic, to be practical. What actually can get done? So what is the most, scary or, biggest gap that is the most concerning? Okay, fine. Clearly important. So you focus on that, how you get that done. But then on the others, what can get done? Because what I don't like to do in compliance is ever waste my business's time. Mm-hmm. So I don't, I call it, I want to win, meaning I want to win for everybody. I want everybody to get a win out of this, meaning your time is not going to be wasted engaging with us. that we will move the ball forward, that we will address these things. And that requires being practical and working with what you actually have rather than what you would like to have. You just will not be able to do all of them, probably, with resources, with technology, with time. I think there are limitations, and I think it's about being comfortable with those limitations, but also continually being able to justify why you made your choices and what choices are at the top of the list and what needs to really be there, and understanding the practical reality of things that can't be there.
And, it's occurred to me as you're talking, you've mentioned a couple of times the relationships are key. And again, not rocket science. We all know the relationships are key, but actually translating that into how do I therefore at scale build those relationships? I'm hearing a theme from you. It's trust building, right? The respect that you're showing by not wasting your business's time, the respect you're showing by being humble and not pretending you know what they go through every day, that curiosity and empathy. Those are the building blocks to trust building, which is the key to, let's say, fast relationship building. You can really win somebody over quickly if you're exhibiting those themes in your interactions with them. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And there are resources that, I think we know this intuitively when we're working in our day-to-day, sort of jobs. Like, that a colleague in maybe another group could help you with, you don't know how to use your new computer. I don't know what it could be.
Ever.
And, IT support is somewhere else in the building. That if you have a colleague in another department, even who's really, somebody you have lunch with, they'll help you probably figure out your computer, right? That about yourself personally. I think you can translate that into your job as a compliance professional. We may have an issue, right? We may have something that comes out of the gap analysis that, we've got to deal with this. Well, I may not be able to, buy a new vendor for technology to change, something. But I bet, if I talk to so-and-so there, who knows? They might have an idea. They might have a fix that we can implement either on a regional level or on a global level that doesn't require, all this other stuff that we probably don't have the money for or the time for. So I think that uses that.
Yeah, no, not to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I'm saying you're hitting all my favorite things there. You said, you use what you have. And that isn't saying don't go get resources when you need them. That's saying leverage the strengths you have. Right? Don't forget you've got strengths in the room if you bring the right people and bring their strengths to bear. That's one thing. The other thing I'm starting to think as you speak is making people feel seen and heard and valued and belonging to the discussion. So not things imposed on them, but co-creating solutions. And it reminds me of the Maya Angelou quote, which is people will forget what you say and did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So It sounds touchy-feely, but actually it's critical to our role. We cannot move the needle with our humans that we serve if we don't see them as humans with strengths and a role to play. So I love this, notion of, again, not them and us, not risk managers, to tell people what to do. And then what does risk specialists do with a risk manager? They bridge that gap and they make sure that the risk manager is part of the solution.
Yeah. So what makes me crazy is when I ever hear that compliance is seen as like the police or internal audit or someone to be held, away. It actually makes me insane because it is not the way that I do compliance. I am as transparent as I possibly can be. There is I tell this to business leaders all the time. There might be areas where, because of confidentiality regarding people, regarding reporters, whatever, there's a small group of things that maybe I can't talk about, but I can talk about a lot of things related to risk in the business and be as transparent with you as possible, because you are the risk manager. And if you don't feel that you're empowered and knowledgeable, then I can never expect you to manage situations. You have to have the knowledge. So I since day one, I am your partner, and I mean that, and I demonstrate that to our business. C&E is a partnership with the business. We are here to support you, and we take that extremely seriously. And so if you don't feel supported, we want to talk about that and fix that, because that's our job. Primary, support the business.
And again, you're reminding me now again of another of my favorite things to talk about now is compliance customer experience. What experience are we giving to the people we serve? If our customers are our employees in this example, what are we selling? Are we selling ease and peace of mind? Are we thinking about their experience with us? And, the investment in doing it well pays massive dividends. As we also know, trust is lost instantly. In an instance, if we don't have that empathy, we can say goodbye to any plans we had partnering well with those individuals if they feel put upon or ignored or irrelevant to the solution. So,
or misled,
or misled. No, I love that. I love that. And the other thing I'm thinking of is the IKEA effect. So this idea that if you are involved in the building of something, you will value it more, right? And again, I think with our business partners, they're savvy people. They are, running the business. They are driving the sales. They should be involved in how to mitigate the risks that present when they're driving these opportunities. No.
Yeah.
Really good stuff. Really good stuff. Well, one other thing that, as you were talking that occurred to me is what you just said about the police piece, because this is real, right? I do perceptions exercises when I first meet a team to see, what does the business think of compliance? And oftentimes, whether it's based on experience with my team or prior experiences, police will come up, rules. And one conundrum I kind of think about a lot is, well, in a small, lean team, the compliance person might be doing everything, right? The risk counseling and the investigations.
Yeah.
And so all the goodwill you engender and the trust you get on the risk counseling can be lost when you start the investigations and have to discipline someone. So I'd love your thoughts. Again, I'm in a lean team, but I'd love your thoughts on the role of the investigations piece of our work. And should it be separated off? Or is there a way that we can be doing investigations in the same way, right? It's an investigation, it's scary, it has significant consequences, but the respect and the trust can still be brought that way. So I'd love your thoughts on either of those two options. I guarantee you our listeners are in both places, right? Some have got investigations teams that are separate, some are having to do it all.
So I love it when the investigation team is separate, under my guidance, but separate group, separate, function. Because I think it's just a healthier, segregation of duties is very nice, and not having the compliance person be, a catch-all. So I do like that, and that's the way we work, and it works extremely well in my opinion. But it's not the reality for everybody to be able to have, a separate function for investigations. And I understand that can be, very burdensome to the person, but also create this perception problem. What I try to make it clear to people about investigations, because it's always fearful, right? It's always, is it's more of a business review. If you really want to think about it, we are reviewing our business practices, our business conduct, our transactions. So business review is a better term in many ways than investigation, right? We don't say interrogation, these words have, meaning. So I think, we might want to get away from the word investigations. I don't use it. I use business reviews. But what I tell everybody is the goal of the business review is to inform the company. The company uses the reviews as a way to understand what happened so that we can then look at it. Did it happen the way we want it to happen, that we expect our business to happen? Did something go sideways? Did somebody go sideways? So it's about information gathering, right? So it's not a hunt. It's not a police, inquiry. It's about what happened in this transaction. Let's understand it. Let's go through it. And I think, while still anyone being questioned about anything is never lovely and fun, we need to really pivot on what it is, right? It's not, looking for the bad guy. It's making sure that the company understands what is happening on a very specific deal or several deal level or some sort of, action or procedure that happened in the company. So it's information so that we can inform the corporation about what is going on. And then the company can make decisions. Does something need to be changed? It doesn't necessarily always mean somebody did something wrong, right? There may be, a policy that needs to be clarified, or actually maybe everything is fine. And I think sometimes it might be great. And that's why I think the risk assessments are great, because it creates this idea that, we can look at things, ask really specific questions, and it's not for, an end result that is going to be, some discipline or something bad. But that is what the company does normally. We normally look at ourselves. We normally take a close look and review our transactions, our business. I think if we do that as companies more often in different ways, it doesn't always have to be an intense, detailed, microscopic, several month review. But if we do that more often and employees and businesses are more, accustomed to it, it'll also create this, it'll reduce the fear and reduce the trepidation.
No, I really like this framing. I mean, you give me lots of ideas here in terms of the investigation is just yet another form of risk assessment and inquiry, right? It helps us with our maturity program, our maturity journey, for the program, our continuous improvement. And I think with the right framing and enough transparency, I've got some questions for you about transparency around investigations in a second, but with the right framing, as you said, the right communication around them, it can be seen as something very helpful for everyone. I mean, of course, the alternative is we turn a blind eye to things, so we can't have that. No one's gonna get behind that, right? It's obviously fairness to those involved as well. So let's talk about what your recommendations are for using investigations or inquiries or reviews, whatever we call them, as a tool to build trust. As a tool to how can we be transparent about aspects of investigations? When I say, I don't mean now confidential pieces, obviously, I mean the process of an investigation, what you can expect, why we do them, and how we do them. How can that build trust?
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely a key. I think too often investigations happen kind of in the background, and then they conclude, and there's a big sort of like boom, on someone's desk saying this is what happened, and sometimes when it's being communicated, it's because it's not good, right? Or 99% of the time, the reason it's being communicated is because it's not a good. So we've just now created a really bad cycle where something's happening. People know it's happening because everybody knows when an investigation or a business review is happening. And then, final outcome, and it's always bad and something to be, worried about coming. However, if we're talking about it more often, in the process, and it takes some discernment about what you can say and when you can say it, but if you're talking about it and you're also talking about the end, when the end is good, when there's no findings, when maybe something is not substantiated, or even somebody did something excellent that you might have found in the investigation, communicate that. Communicate as much as you can, when you can, as often as you can. So that there is an understanding that, when you say this is a feedback process, an information gathering process, it's to help everybody leverage up their, their understanding of risk and their understanding of, how to, act with integrity and make sure that the company is acting with integrity. When you build that feedback in and really show that, then I think you've created a different dynamic, or you've started to create a different culture around, fear of investigations.
That's so true. We don't often twin the investigations transparency piece you just highlighted so beautifully with the speak up culture, even though of course they're so intertwined. I mean, with that trust, you're more likely to engender more speak up and the psychological safety to do so. So I'd love to, one of my favorite topics, I'd love to hear what your views are on speak up, and maybe it's very similar to what you've just said, but how would you advise us to make sure we are moving the needle there as well, and making sure our employees and our partners, our customers feel comfortable speaking up, trust us to speak up, let's say that?
It's hard. And in many countries, they have, because of World War II and things that happened with regard to, neighbors calling out neighbors, with, horrible results of, the Holocaust, and families being, turned against by their neighbors. There is an anti-speak up culture. And I think what many companies don't understand when they go into a country like France, for example, there is, no, speak up is bad, actually. We have to understand that there is this cultural reticence around it. So we have to work even harder to explain what we mean by speak up. Speak up is not necessarily to call out somebody that they've done badly, but ask a question. Understand what's going on in maybe a deal. Maybe you're not sure. You don't think someone's done something wrong, but you're not sure what's going on. You're just not comfortable, or you're just questioning. That's okay. That's speak up as well. You just don't know. You just don't want to question to your manager at that point, or you want to use the anonymous report. That's fine, right? I think destigmatizing speak up, where some places it might be seen as calling someone out and going after them. It's still a challenge. I think phone at the top, guidance says that it's very important. Well, show it, I think, it's one thing to say it. I would like and encourage people, if they've spoken up as managers, speak about that if they can, right? And what people don't realize is it doesn't have to be in the context. And Oracle's been really great about finding inventive ways of doing this, of showcasing good behavior. It doesn't have to be in the context of the business. You might have been in a sporting event. You might play professional football, or not professional, but amateur at a high level football when you were in university, and you might have had to speak up in that personal life of yours. Well, you can talk about that to your employees as an example of what speak up really means, and sort of show as a manager that you've done that behavior. You've actually modeled it for them. And that it is similar to what we're asking for them at the company.
And I think there's also the definition of speak up. We speak up to someone like us, right? Like a formal complaint and a whistleblower. But some of what you're talking about is actually speak with. So be able in the moment to be an active bystander.
I love that.
And I also love what you said, curious coaching questions as opposed to don't do that. So I like to use parenting analogies. But if I'm trying to cross the dangerous road with my children, I could say, don't do that. I could also say, is this a good place to cross? I could also ask, what do we need to do before we cross, right? Same kind of options in the workplace, right? Yes, you must sometimes just say stop, right? And you should feel comfortable to say stop. And I want to talk in a minute about why people don't. Say stop, or ask if this is the right thing to do. And can we talk about it? Pause, deflect, discuss. Various tools that you've got when it comes to true active bystandership. And then, of course, the curious coaching question, which is, well, let's just get some help here. Maybe I don't know what the best way is. And my spidey sense is telling me something's off. I want to feel comfortable raising that. And again, why do people not feel? I mean, you use some of the history in Europe, and I think that's very relevant. We'll talk more about that in a second as well. But it really can also be what's happening in the company. I mean, how willing are people to hear that feedback? How does let's go back to this, my crossing the road with my children. Do I have a teenager that's angsty and doesn't want to hear mummy's feedback? Thinks they know better and will never hear what mummy has to say about crossing the road? Or do I have somebody that has created an environment where they actually trust me to think, oh, if she's speaking up, she means something, right? Same thing. How are we receiving feedback? How are we creating space for people to help us with those curious coaching questions? How are we responding? And of course, the one fear is retaliation, like literal retaliation that you described, in history, but also, if I speak up, I'll be branded as a snitch, bother, disruptor. And I do think that's got to be critical. Forget the hotline for a second. That's the population. But how are we going to encourage people to give and receive just-in-time feedback or questions that will help us all make better decisions? Again, North Star, make better decisions.
Yeah, I think it starts with manager training, right? I think managers have to be trained and be hired and promoted because they have the skills of encouraging dialogue, conversation, right? If you think about, I don't know, I mean, we're too young to think about like the 1950s, but what I hear, when I watched Mad Men back in the day, is that was a very you do what your boss tells you and you just go and do it and you never question and go, that was what I, envisioned it was like to work in a company in the 1950s. We are so far from that today, right? I mean, that is not how anyone wants to operate, and that's not how any company, says its managers should operate. So I think we need to make sure that we are teaching managers how not to do that, how to be more inclusive, how to have conversations, all kinds of conversations, whether it be about corruption, about good practices, whether it be about diversity and inclusion and making people feel welcome. I think it's all on a continuum. And so, again, building bridges with, HR and whoever is the, DEI officer, and building that into how managers are trained. And so it's not just talking about diversity in the team or talking about, making people's voices are heard, but saying also on our practices, on, whether we're acting, in the right way in this deal, whether we're following policy. It's all of a piece. I joke all the time with employees. I say compliance and ethics, not just another LOB. We're just we're everything, right? We're the ethos of the company, and I think that has to flow down in reality of how even managers are hired, selected, trained to discuss and be managers of a team.
I mean, and you're right. I mean, you mentioned the 50s, but of course, hierarchical management is not a thing of the past, right? And I think, just to pick up on a couple of themes you've already addressed today, we are creating blind spots if we don't want to hear what other people have to say, or we don't leverage the strengths, to your point, of those around us. Like, we've got this knowledge, we've got eyes and ears everywhere, but if we create structures where we don't want to hear it, and you should know your place and you shouldn't, disrupt the hierarchy, you are actually literally creating blind spots, which will make you less equipped to make decisions. So, I love to use this framing with my teams. Your leaders want a fully informed choice. We're paying you to bring a fully informed choice. To the degree it's your leader's choice, not yours, right? Yeah. So that means information has to come, pros and cons, options analysis, things you think I might not want to hear. Actually, I'm probably more interested in those things than the things you think I do want to hear, because I've got to be curious about my blind spots, because if not, I'm literally handicapping myself. I'm making decisions in silos, to your point again, the point about silos. And that's where we get in trouble, I think.
Yeah. But you need the right kind of leader, right? You're the kind of leader, you want to hear it, but not everybody, I think, who's in a leadership role is comfortable hearing things that maybe, that are not, following the workflow or the plan. And I think that is what we should focus on when we're hiring and promoting leaders. That's a very important trait, to be able to be open, to be receptive to information that may not be in the plan.
Right. And we go back to ease and peace of mind. Not easy. Of course, this is not easy. But ease and peace of mind is knowing that I've got all the data points I need to make the right decision. Anxiety, for me, true anxiety, is knowing that I haven't created the conditions where I will get that information.
Yeah.
So, I hope that people see that it's actually in their own interests to get the information. And we can't just point fingers, wow, I wish they'd told me. Well, ask a curious question, why might they have not told us? What might we have done, or what might my predecessor have done? Doesn't matter. What conditions might we have as a company have created where people don't feel comfortable speaking up? And then it goes back to that other point I made about risk assessments. Yes, risk assessment tends to be a diagnosis, not a cure. Sure, it's anxiety producing to know that you might have a list of things you need to change. But with the list, you can then make a risk-based assessment and prioritize what you do next.
And with leaders, when you ask the risk, one simple question that we ask is, what's the risk in your organization, your department? These are the risks. Okay, any others? How, well, this, but, this is what I know. Well, how do you know? What do you do as a manager to identify risk that maybe you're not aware of? And that always puts people back a little bit in their chair and like, what is it that I don't know? Well, if you don't know, the only way you're going to find out is by talking to your teams. Right. And so just putting it on them to sort of pull it out of their people. What do I need to know about? Anything you didn't bring up, opening that dialogue, I think, is super, super important.
It's important. I think we also need to recognize the human trait that is testing the waters first, right? So I bring this up to say this. Oftentimes you might find employees bringing up non-material things to you. And you might think, oh, I'm wasting my time. In my mind, that's an opportunity to build trust. So, right, well, how did you handle the small things? I am no way going to trust you with the big stuff if I don't see the trust and the respect when it comes to the small stuff. So I often say, speaking up about smaller things is a gateway to the trust that you can build. I like to use that framework because you mentioned, a challenging, none of us like to generalize, but you've mentioned some challenging historical reasons why a certain region or a certain country might just, even outside work, have this reticence for speaking up in the way we're talking about. I do want to underscore what you said. I think but some of my readers know I did a PhD in law and war. And, it really is very connected what you said in terms of that. Why don't people speak up, right? That what conditions did we create that allowed those horrendous things to happen? And, then and today, right? It's not just historical, as you know. And Irvin Staub is a philosopher. He put out a book called The Roots of Evil. And he also put together a program of active bystandership for law enforcement. He now does it in schools for bullying. The idea being we need to train people with this skill of active bystandership. Irvin Staub is a Holocaust survivor. He's a child Holocaust survivor. So again, his roots, his roots of his philosophies are that same question. How could this happen? How did humans turn a blind eye or look away or didn't leverage their collective strengths to stop something that atrocious? So I know this is sensitive. I don't want to go too far into it, but it really is relevant.
Because to speak up, and look, whistleblowers, we I don't know if we were going to talk about whistleblowers, whistleblowers is something, when you're in the enforcement division of the SEC, you deal with whistleblowers all the time. For me, they are so valued, even now internally. I value them at the SEC. I value them now all the time because there is so much bravery that has to go into speaking up, because it is, again, people don't know. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know the ramifications. Even in a company that is so clear, that retaliation is not going to happen, I think it's just still a human need. We're social animals. There's still a reticence, as people to talk about something that maybe we don't even know what the ramifications are going to be on someone else or, their career or things like that. So to be a whistleblower is a very brave thing, and I think, it's very important for companies to get that right, how they handle that kind of interaction. To your point about building trust, maybe it's not a whistleblower on, the biggest issue in the world. Maybe it's just a small thing. And to show that employee that, they're heard, they're rewarded, they're, given a voice and their voice is heard.
Yeah, it's so important. I both with the SFP whistleblower program would have met whistleblowers and spoken to them. And, obviously we're seeing it at the point where it had to escalate to that level. Oftentimes the backstory is they were not treated well the first time they spoke up within the company. But I want to go, on the positive note to the point you made earlier. If companies could celebrate the stories of when someone spoke up and it really helped, and celebrate that, right? Even if it's still anonymous, just say, we were able to make this change, save this money, do this thing, because one of you was brave enough to speak up. That would be wonderful. Yeah. I would like a day, Christina, where we say it's not brave anymore. Yeah. We need to have courage to speak up. I know that's asking a lot, but that should be our North Star, where we don't need to call whistleblowers brave anymore because it's our default. We all understand intimately that this is what needs to be done. And again, don't forget the critical piece. You have to be able to receive the information. If you are a blocker to receiving it, if you are making people feel uncomfortable for speaking up, you are part of the problem. Exactly. And we have to check ourselves. I have to, brace myself when I ask for feedback, knowing I might not want to hear what's said, but it's a skill we have to develop. It's a muscle, and none of us necessarily organically have it, right? We just have to trust and build trust. So I love it. Thank you for letting me speak about that because I feel really passionate about that one.
It's important. I love it.
Yeah. Well, look, we've talked a lot about leadership and, the mood in the middle manager piece is critical. I don't want to skim over that because you've said that's one of the cures. But I want to talk about your leadership. So, you lead an effective regional program is for a giant, multinational company. I'd love to get some tips from you for our listeners about that. So I'm going to ask you a broad opening question, but please take this where you want to. What does it mean to build a modern compliance program in a multinational organization?
I think a modern program understands how to use technology, how to use data, but also a modern program realizes that, the people doing compliance can come from different areas of business expertise. We in EMEA, we have our compliance team sitting regionally. So I have 2 people in Sub-Saharan Africa. We break it up like that, Sub-Saharan Africa and, the Middle East. We have 2 people in the Middle East, someone in Eastern Central Europe, looking to grow always. And in Western Europe. So we're there. And I think that helps a lot too, because it's not being handled from, a vertical or a centralized corporate in, another country, the United States, for example, as our headquarters. It's actually happening regionally. So when, someone on my team who is based in Kenya is talking to Kenyan leadership, or the country leadership team, it's a very local, it's a very field based approach to compliance. And I think that is already down the road on trust. So I think that's very important. I think for the compliance team to reflect what is the business team in actual people, and in their knowledge of the business. I think that's number one key towards modern. But I think leveraging technology is super, super important. There is no way that, human beings can be everywhere, do everything, especially with, Oracle or, a big company, that's sitting in many different countries and, doing lots of different lines of business. You need to leverage technology and be smart about that.
Yeah, and let's dig about the technology and the humans and where they can be placed. So I'm in this situation, for a company that's growing globally, growing fast, that doesn't yet have that regional presence everywhere, how are we going to bridge that gap? How are we going to leverage the technology and the humans to make sure that there's no region left behind, that we're not, still in the case of, US-based companies, a US-centric company that makes the regions feel like second-class citizens? That's quite common, right?
Yeah.
So with a lean, small team that might want to grow but doesn't yet have the resources, but the company is definitely growing beyond the US. What's your advice for someone in that situation in terms of building an effective
that relationship? Well, I think, as somebody who works in the field, what the field doesn't like is when things come, already baked from corporate, they're not part of the discussion. There's a lot of knowledge in the field, and working, in local countries gives you a different perspective, whether it be, the challenges with getting foreign currency in Nigeria, for example. I mean, that adds a level to our deals and our transactions that is not present in other countries. And I think in order to understand the challenges before policy is maybe rolled out or before a new initiative is to just talk and hear what are the challenges that you're facing. Thank goodness for Zoom, right? Or, whatever, video platform. I know a lot of people are like, oh, too much. I've had too much video calls, but it is in the absence of being able to see each other and talk, in the flesh, it is super, super important, and to just have those conversations and make them about nothing in the beginning, right? I mean, make it about a low stakes conversation. Find a way to connect on something that's, I don't know, fun, wonderful, some partnership on something that has nothing to do with the bigger issues, so that when you do get to the bigger issues, there's already a level of trust and understanding.
No, that's right. And look, you're right. There's the low-hanging fruit of technology. And we can talk all day about remote versus in person and all the benefits of actually going out and flying and visiting teams. And certainly, I want to do a combination of those things, resources allowing. But you remind me of a story. So when I was at Disney, I started at Disney before the pandemic and then went into fully remote with Disney. And, there's the pros and cons, as you know. And I do realize also the massive benefit of that happening in terms of professional life was because I was no longer going to be focused on Burbank, like the studio in California, which was proximate to my home. I was now able to really genuinely access everyone equally on this Zoom call. One of the things I did with someone in my India team was we started a Bollywood karaoke club over Zoom.
I love it.
Sang, me at 6 a.m, her at 6, and I don't know what time it was. My husband thought I was crazy. Like, why are you singing songs at 6 a.m?
Why not?
Why not? Exactly. I mean, I don't know how or why we got there, but you're right. I mean, I don't know that I would have flown to India to do karaoke, but for some reason we decided we had a mutual interest. She sang beautifully, I sang terribly. It doesn't matter. We just put the YouTube video on and sang together. It was beautiful. And again, wonderful. Relationship building can be anything. It doesn't have to be go to a bar or happy hour. It can be anything. And to your point about leveraging technology, sounds quite ominous, but the technology is right here in front of us. The Zoom call enabled that kind of bonding with someone, 12 hours time zone away. And then when we came to do the work, we had a different level of trust and relationship that just accelerated it. Yeah. So just a good example of, for our listeners, when we say leverage technology, it doesn't have to be rocket science or a new vendor, procurement piece. It can just be using what we've got in different ways. Yeah.
So is there a podcast where you're going to sing for us?
No, never. You'll be very grateful for that.
I'd like to request it.
But no, I mean, it's just, even the fact that you're in Brussels right now and I'm here in right? It's just incredible what we can do. even with the limitations, I'll give you a hug when I see you when you come to DC, but if not, there's other ways to give you a hug. So
But I will say there's no substitute for in person, right? So even I'm fully remote as well, but before pandemic, and now again, I travel a lot, and I try to use that strategically to meet people as much as possible in very, large groups, because being able to see, I mean, we're humans, we're social animals, seeing somebody, being able to, I was joking, being able to smell them, being able to touch them, it's a different level. So it is important, I think. And I think companies do need to make sure that compliance and, these kinds of functions, legal functions, can be present sometimes in person.
So it's so don't be afraid to ask for the resources for that, because it pays so many dividends. Back to the trust building, right? A little bit of investment of an in-person visit. And again, in this environment, people know it's an effort, right? To go across the country and do it and get the resources and commit to that. But once you've done that, I found the same with my few regional visits I've done. People have felt seen and heard, and it's set the relationship up forever, right? Ad infinitum, am I going to get benefits from that? And are they going to get benefits from feeling part of the organization? And I don't want to brush over what you said about, you are in the field. You might have started your career in the US, you work for a US based company, but you are in the field, right? And it is important that, again, that perceptions analysis. It's not just that we feel like the police. Sometimes we feel like corporate silos in this ivory tower, with a very maybe Western outlook on a global company. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that elephant in the room and then be curious as to how we can bridge that gap.
Yeah. Acknowledging it is the beginning. That's
the first part of respect, right? And then, again, not assuming you know how to fix it. Ask your people in the field what they think they need, because it's often not much. Like you said, maybe a visit, maybe different types of questions rather than mandates. And I really appreciate, I feel like I get free advice in my podcast all the time. So I'm going to ask you, so I am, currently in the global headquarters building an international team. And I'd love, your tips on traps the global can fall into. I don't want to be that person that feels like I'm losing control. So how is it working when you do what you said, when you allow the regions to develop their regional compliance programs? And how's Oracle doing that to make you feel empowered and trusted, and clearly then seeing the benefits of it? How's that transition, and what advice do you give to someone like me about to build that?
So I've had to learn how to do that, because again, I do come from a US sort of focused mindset, and I've had to learn to really let the regions build something, not to 100%, because the key is to bring it along to some degree where you can then show it to corporate, right? So whether it be, the EU whistleblower directive is a really good example. So that is happening in the EU countries. All the EU countries had to implement the directive in their national laws. And some of them are really wild and radical, and they don't fit with what the company's right now program is, right? So for example, I think it's like Lithuania. You must respond to the reporter within 3 days, something like that. A lot of companies are not ready to do that. They don't have a facility to respond in 3 days through whatever, international portal that's centralized. So, when you're first presenting that to corporate, you could go too early and say, okay, this is what we got to do. How are we going to do it? And of course the corporate response is going to be like, well, we have our system, and, I think we're good enough. And you let us know why we have to change it. Lithuania, it can get lost, right? Or it can be just the wrong pitch. And I think it's about, creating sort of a project that it can be understood. It's far enough down the road that it has all the details, and then really pitching it to the corporate organization and saying, look, we've done the work. I think what happens sometimes is the field might throw a problem over and expect corporate to kind of fix it. And corporate's still trying to understand, what are you talking about? What's going on in the field? And I think we don't do enough sometimes to articulate it well enough, translate it into a framework that is operationally understandable. Like, oh, that's how you suggest we fix it. Oh, well, let us explain to you why maybe that doesn't work this way, but then let's start meshing our approaches and see where we can come in the middle. On the other hand, So I just criticize the field for maybe not, always presenting everything well enough. I think on the other hand, corporate sometimes thinks they know what's going on. And they're like, okay, let's fix that. And it seems to come out of nowhere, a change or some different, implementation. And there hasn't been enough setting the landscape, right? Enough like getting people's opinions, bringing them into the conversation. Maybe it's actually a good fix. But sometimes I see people in the field will react maybe like, I didn't hear about this. I had no idea. And the truth is maybe they didn't hear about it. And that's not good. That's, corporate, I think, needs to have much more, maybe time spent on laying the groundwork, making people understand what's coming. Even if it is a change that's going to be happening and there's not really a way to change it, communication, setting the scene helps.
Yeah, no, I love that. Back to respect, communication, empathy. Some of the basics with whether it's with your employees or with your actual teams out there, I think, again, I know it's easy to say. I don't want to patronize our listeners at all by saying the obvious, but I really love that you're giving us some practical tips on that, right? It's like, how can this come up? Because in the end, someone has to make a decision on what the priorities are, but back to the fully informed choice. Are you providing a fully informed choice to someone that's allocating resources? Are you building the trust where you can get more autonomy where needed locally? Because decisions need to be made locally and fast sometimes as well. Yeah. And
having that autonomy, though, there has to be trust, right? And I think, sometimes we don't trust, people to do the job as much as we should, like sort of back off a little bit, let them do the job. I think also there's cultural implications. I notice sometimes, if you're talking about an American company, Americans are really good, and I'm an American, so I can say this, Americans are really good about saying like, I can do this, and I'm going to take that on. Culturally, in other countries, in Europe is a good example, people are a little bit more, not as willing to promote themselves, not as willing to say, I have no idea, I've never done it before, but I'm sure I can handle it. They're a little bit more like, well, let me study it. Let me understand it. Let me make sure that I get it. And then I'll volunteer myself. So I think there's also a dynamic that gets set up where the Americans want to hear, I'm going to dive in. I'm going to go for it. And maybe a European might say, well, let me think about it a little bit. And so immediately the Americans are like, oh, they can't do it. They can't do it. And it's not that. It's that they're just much more thoughtful. They're much less willing to grab it, and go for it. Much less, American, I can do it. And we need to understand that that's not a sign of unwillingness or incompetence or lack of skill. It's just a sign of a different approach, a more thoughtful approach, maybe a more careful approach.
It's funny laughing as you're describing that, because obviously I'm a Brit that's come to America. And one of the reasons I explain my move to America is exactly what you just said, because I'm more like the Americans in that way.
I know.
Which is probably why you and I have done a switch, even though we've got very similar career paths, we've done a switch. Love it. Well, look, so many good themes here. I'm going to return to one of them that we talked about. So many magical themes. The beauty of this partnership between the regulators and the companies. Again, you and I have got this unique insight because we've been in both. And I think it's going to be our swan song. It's like, they're not to be feared. We can work together. I love that. Oracle has had some experience working with US government and others, right, on an enforcement investigation. So I don't want to, not talk about that a little bit with you. I know a lot of your team's work has been focused on ensuring that you have effective measures in place to prevent and detect corruption in partnership with the US government and others, right? So they say never waste a good crisis. And no one wants their company to be in that situation. But of course, it focuses the mind when it comes to prioritizing and resourcing. So, to the degree you can talk about this, what blind spots should we, the listeners, be looking for as we try to learn from each other? I used many case studies, Oracle's one of them. What can you now tell us from your experience that we should be looking out for as your peers?
Yeah. So absolutely. I think focuses the mind is a really good way of putting it, because it definitely focuses the entire mind of the company on that. And that's not a bad thing. It's a stressful thing. It's an unpleasant thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. One of the things that I think, I've taken away a couple of things from that experience, which, again, has been beneficial, right? It's always, I think, depending on how you frame it, and I think, excellent companies like Oracle, they frame it in a way that is a positive, right? Like, how is this going to help us? And we're going to take this, and make sure that this benefits us for the future. Any investigation, I don't like that term, any business review, right, that you're doing as a compliance professional, any internal audit, you must address root causes at that stage. Root cause analysis is fundamental, right? We talk about risk assessments, but when you have a finding, what is the root cause analysis? Are you doing that? I don't know that all companies are doing root cause analysis all the time, as rigorously, as frequently as they should be doing it. And I think, that's something that the SEC is very focused on, DOJ. What's the root cause analysis? And, when a company can articulate that, they've really advanced their ability to reach a good settlement. They've advanced their ability to make the regulator understand that the company is serious about compliance. The root cause analysis, do it all the time. Nobody's doing it enough, and nobody's doing it thoroughly enough, I don't think. And then third-party risk. I don't think anyone is looking at third-party risk as much as they should. Now, that does not mean that third-party risk, is something that can be solved. That's not what I'm saying. I think third-party risk is always a huge risk. The regulators are focused on it, laser focused. They were laser focused on it when you and I were there. It was a huge focus of our work. So I don't think it's something to be solved, but I think if we're talking about prioritization, I don't think it can be ever off the number one priority list for companies. And I think what that means is also we have to be smart about attacking it from all different angles. So this concept of silos, right? Third-party management touches a lot of different areas, whether you're talking about your sanctions compliance team, whether your third-party, due diligence, your life cycle, your onboarding, your risk management during their engagement with you, your contracting. All of these things, I think, need to be synthesized or knit together in a very efficient way. I'm not sure that companies do that as well as they could. It doesn't mean that they'll solve it. I just think there needs to be more work on it than people do.
Yeah, it's very scary because it seems pretty insurmountable. If you think about, like you said, all the different types of third parties, where they are, the structuring and ownership issues, the sanctions issues, always evolving. I think it's true to say in the EU, there's many more due diligence laws passed and coming. Even in the ESG space, you've got supply chain management on top of sanctions, on top of ad-risk media. So yeah, I think you're right. But it's as you said, it's a high risk. And it's a feature of all the enforcement cases. I think there was one released today where it's an individual prosecution in relation to third-party risk. The SAP case was earlier this year. On and on and on. If you look at any of the FCPA enforcement cases, I challenge you to find one that didn't involve third-party intermediaries somewhere in the globe. And oftentimes, back to the root cause. Look, I know when you say root cause, we're not saying who should we blame. We're saying what can we learn, right? What can we learn? What blind spots did we have? What low-hanging fruit might there be where we just didn't do this thing, or we did it, but we didn't monitor its effectiveness, or we didn't test the control? It's a big climb for some of us to get those controls in place, and that's not the end of the story. Then the story is, are they working? And so I agree with you. An external investigation or inquiry focuses the mind. But if we can build into our programs this sense of continuous improvement, root cause analysis, checking for blind spots, looking for low-hanging fruit, it doesn't always have to be a big expense in a new tool.
Yeah.
Actually, I found what you've said, with the silos, sometimes we're all paying for separate tools. Right?
Yes, redundancy is something that I think, can be avoided.
And also, one bane of my existence is vendors. Having to learn about all the vendors and what they offer, it can take up a lot of time. But one thing I have learned when speaking with vendors is they want to meet our unmet needs. So if you can articulate the needs, there's always some, entrepreneurial startup or, existing vendor that wants to put on their roadmap what it is your company needs. So I do think, when I say it's insurmountable, it feels insurmountable. But there's ways in which you can move the needle.
But I think articulating the need, like you say that, and I'm thinking to myself, can I articulate it? How, I think that is something we need to challenge ourselves and see whether we can really articulate the need. And maybe that goes into something that, should be part of whether it's working or not. Like, once we do the root cause analysis, the gap analysis, well, how do we articulate what we need to solve here?
Right. But back to your point, like we are representing companies and individuals that are in the field. If there's going to be any innovation here, it's going to be because of the information we've got. Let's give the vendors a fully informed choice as to where they put their technology. Let's give the regulators a fully informed evaluation where they know what our teams are facing in the fields and the true effectiveness. What I really worry about is paying for processes or implementing processes that I can see are only, I'm picking a number, 20% effective. And I can see intuitively the gaps. This is what it does do. This is what the limitations. So I think you're right. Actually, articulating the need is really critical because the regulators don't want us throwing money after ineffective procedures or processes either. And, we know benchmarking is critical, right? It's good to know what your peers are doing. But what if none of us are doing it right, to your point, right? Maybe it's okay to have, some brainstorming with your peers to say, well, what is the need that we're all struggling with? In truth, why do we think this is not effective? That's how you get to defensible, not defensive. It's another one of my swan songs. It's like, we don't want to be defensive and just check boxes and say, oh, we're doing something. We paid some money towards this. I know there's a couple of cases at least where people had processes in place, but they just weren't effective. They were missing obvious gaps, and we have an opportunity as compliance leaders to inquire, again, ask those curious coaching questions. What would good look like? What would better look like? What would best look like? And what's our route to getting there?
And to whiteboard it, not to be afraid, like, oh, it's going to cost too much money. It's going to be too hard. Okay, that's a tomorrow question. Like, what do we actually need? And then we'll discuss whether it's possible or what framework, how much it would cost.
And, to my colleagues, and I feel this way too, think, oh gosh, Christina and Hemmer have talked about so many things. How do I get all this done? I mean, again, you said leveraging that technology. There is technology now that can help us with the basic low-hanging fruit processes, the AI, the bots, the workflows. So that can free us up for this thinking, this whiteboarding. I think if, we're doing well if we can get some space to think in the way that you've described and move the needle on program maturity. So for me, Christina, I want to thank you. That's true compliance leadership. I really appreciate you doing what you do in your company for your employees, for your teams, but also coming here today to share it with us.
My pleasure.
No, it's been wonderful. We could go on and on. I'm going to ask you just one question to finish, which is really not about much, but maybe will tie us up beautifully. So there's this children's book that I really like by Carol McLeod called, what is it called? Did you fill a bucket today? Oh, I'm forgetting the name of it. Anyway, about bucket filling. How did I fill your bucket today? Or how did you fill a bucket today? And what the idea is, it's a kid's book, but the idea is that we all have a bucket and you can go about your day filling other people's buckets or depleting the buckets. So doing things that are kind, fill people's buckets. Doing things that are unkind could take out. And of course, we all have our own buckets too, and we can fill our own buckets as well. So my question to you is, what fills your bucket, whether at work or outside work?
My bucket. My bucket has lots of cookies in it.
Oh, I can see that right now. Yes, another good children's.
I don't know why it's here it's almost 4:00, so it's coffee and cookie time.
Well, you're in Belgium. I mean, my goodness, I would go to the patisserie right now. Gosh.
I am a huge cookie lover. And I will tell you, I discovered when I came to Belgium a cookie called it's called Lotus. You probably have it in the United States. It's Lotus, I believe. Okay. And it's speculoos.
Oh, yeah.
It is so good. It's like the most delicious cookie. So that's in my bucket. But really,
your bucket.
Seriously, something that I've been thinking a lot about. I don't know. My birthday's coming up, and just kind of at this age in my life, and women that I know, women leadership with women. So working and having collaborations with now, women who have grown alongside me during my professional journey, like yourself, and connecting and helping each other, sharing knowledge, is incredibly valuable. I thrive on it. I love it. And I hope to be able to give back to it, so I hope I'm filling someone else's bucket. And then also, I have to say my team, right? Being able to work with people who, just make you better every day, who, that, you're part of a team, that they support you, you support them, I think is the greatest joy. And it's something that I look forward to continuing doing and really valuing, never taking, for granted, and really appreciating going forward.
Ah, what a beautiful way to end today. I mean, it's Women's History Month. You've been a beautiful part of my history. Thank you.
Mine too.
And a good friend. I've remembered the title of the book. It's Have You Filled a Bucket Today by Carol McLeod. And you
I will look for
my bucket today. So thank you. I really appreciate you. Really, really excited for our listeners to hear from you. Where can we find you? On LinkedIn, I'm assuming we can find you.
On LinkedIn, yes, absolutely. Yeah, easy.
Well, have a lovely day. Enjoy your afternoon pastries. I'll be thinking of you as I start my day, and we'll see you.
Have a cookie on me.
Yes, have a cookie on Christina. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Emma. Bye. Good to see you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.